My God, this incredible HFY masterpiece found you today. Witness the legend, starting now.
The Galactic Union of Shared Knowledge had, in its infinite wisdom, decided that the best way to promote interspecies unity was to throw everyone into the same classroom and hope for the best. This was, objectively, a terrible idea. Professor Gorvik Spellin had been teaching xenobiology at the Interstellar Academy of Voss Prime for 37 years. 37 long, peaceful, relatively non-violent years. He had taught Filori students whose 6 arms made note-taking almost offensively efficient. He had guided Durathi pupils who communicated entirely through color changes in their skin and still somehow managed to pass his exams. He had even once survived a full semester with a Veldori student, a species known galaxy-wide for asking questions that had no answers, and then crying about it. He had never, not once in 37 years, taught a human. That streak ended on a Tuesday. Her name was Petra Wynn. She was 19 years old, from a place called Stavros Ridge on the 3rd continent of Earth, a planet that the rest of the galaxy referred to in hushed tones, coded warning files, and the occasional screaming nightmare. She stood at the entrance of Classroom 7 on the first morning of the semester, looked at the pale blue walls, the cushioned Filori-designed seating, the gentle humming of the environmental controls set to a soothing 72 degrees, and said, out loud, to no one in particular, "This place smells like a hospital." Gorvik, standing at the front of the room arranging his datapads in the very specific order that had brought him peace for 3 decades, heard this and filed it away under concerning first impressions. He had done his research. Of course he had. He was a professor, not a fool. He had read the Union's standard briefing on human biology, which was 40 pages long and contained more exclamation points than any scientific document had any business containing. He had read the supplementary notes. He had even, at the suggestion of his colleague Professor Duna Ferris, read the informal guide written by a Filori diplomat who had spent 6 months on Earth and returned with 2 broken ribs, a renewed appreciation for life, and a very strong opinion about human recreational activities. The guide had one sentence highlighted in red: "Do not, under any circumstances, make physical contact with a human in a context they have not consented to. They will not simply be offended. Something much worse will happen and you will deserve it." Gorvik had read this, nodded thoughtfully, and assumed it was an exaggeration. He was, as would become clear in approximately 4 weeks, catastrophically wrong. But let us not get ahead of ourselves, because the first 3 weeks were actually fine. Surprisingly, bewilderingly, almost insultingly fine, given how thoroughly the rest of the faculty had prepared him for disaster. Petra Wynn sat in the second row. She had dark hair pulled back into something practical, eyes that were a shade of brown that Gorvik species associated with fertile soil and rich harvests, which he found oddly calming, and a general expression that suggested she was always listening to something slightly more interesting playing in her own head. She took notes by hand, on paper, with a pen, like an absolute primitive, but her notes, as Gorvik would discover when he occasionally walked past her desk, were extremely good. Detailed, accurate, full of small drawings in the margins that somehow clarified concepts better than his actual diagrams did. She did not, in those first 3 weeks, cause a single problem. Her fellow students were more nervous about her than she was about them. The Filori student, Varen Toss, sat 3 seats away from her and had quietly asked Gorvik on the second day whether humans were capable of spontaneous territorial aggression. Gorvik had told him firmly that humans were perfectly civilized beings and that xenophobia was unbecoming of a student at the Interstellar Academy. Varen had nodded, moved 1 more seat away from Petra, and continued watching her with the cautious eyes of someone who had read too many incident reports. The Durathi student Brana Chi communicated her own feelings on the matter by turning a very specific shade of pale gold every time Petra reached into her bag too quickly. Pale gold in Durathi culture meant bracing for impact. Gorvik chose not to translate this for anyone. Petra seemed entirely unbothered by any of it. "You don't find it strange?" Gorvik asked her once, after class on the 12th day, when she had stayed late to ask a question about the nutritional adaptations of cave-dwelling species on low-light planets. "The way your classmates react to you?" Petra looked at him with those calm brown eyes and said, "Professor Spellin, I grew up on a continent where the winters hit -40 and the bears sometimes break into houses looking for food. I think I can handle people being a little nervous." Gorvik processed this. The bears break into houses. Yeah, voluntarily. They want what is inside the house, so yes, voluntarily. And this is normal, where you are from. Petra tilted her head slightly, in the way that Gorvik had begun to recognize as her equivalent of a shrug. "Normal enough that we have a saying about it. Lock your doors, watch your corners, and never run." Gorvik filed this under deeply relevant information and resolved to read more about earth bears. He did not read about earth bears. He got busy. The The semester was moving along, the coursework was escalating, and he had 19 students to manage, only one of whom was capable of breaking the laws of physiological expectation on a Tuesday afternoon. The problems, when they began, started small. Week 4, chapter on Deathworld fauna classification. Gorvik was explaining the standard threat tier system developed by the Union's Department of Planetary Risk. It was a straightforward lecture. Clean, well organized. He had given it 14 times before. Tier 1, he explained, were nuisance creatures. Small, annoying, minimally dangerous. Tier 2, creatures capable of harming non-armored beings under standard conditions. Tier 3, creatures requiring specialized equipment to safely engage. Tier 4, creatures that presented genuine danger to trained military personnel. And then there was Tier 5, the theoretical ceiling, reserved for apex predators of Deathworlds. Creatures so lethal that any civilization unlucky enough to share a planet with them was expected to simply not thrive. Gorvik had pulled up the standard list of Tier 5 species. It was not a long list. 11 entries, each one the biological equivalent of a nightmare, each one responsible for keeping xenobiologists awake at night. Petra raised her hand. Gorvik acknowledged her. "Is the Terran brown bear on this list?" she asked. "No," Gorvik said. "The Terran brown bear is a Tier 3 classification. Dangerous to unarmored beings, requires caution, but not categorically lethal under standard conditions." Petra stared at him. It was not an aggressive stare. It was the stare of someone doing a very careful internal calculation. The kind of calculation that involved restraint. "Okay," she said finally. Gorvik continued the lecture. 3 minutes later, Petra raised her hand again. "What about the Terran saltwater crocodile? Tier 3. Similar classification." Another pause. Longer this time. "The Cape buffalo? Tier 2, with elevated risk in herd conditions." The pause after this one was so long that Varan Toss had time to turn a very interesting shade of blue. Pale blue in Falori culture meant "I am extremely glad I do not live on that planet." "All right," Petra said, in a voice that suggested she was personally forgiving someone for a very significant mistake. "I will accept these classifications and move on." Gorvik was not sure why this felt like a threat. He moved on. But here was the thing about Petra Wynne. Here was the thing that Gorvik would later describe to his colleagues as the fundamental issue that I should have recognized before disaster became inevitable. She was patient. She was genuinely, deeply, almost frighteningly patient. She would absorb information that she disagreed with. She would file it away. She would let it sit. But she never actually let it go. Every week in every lesson where the classification system came up again, she would ask one more quiet question, and every answer Gorvik gave her would be absorbed with that same expression of careful, contained disagreement. She was not rude about it. She did not argue. She did not disrupt class. She simply persisted, steadily and quietly, in the direction of being entirely right about something that the Union's official curriculum had entirely wrong. And Gorvik, because he had 37 years of habit behind him and a syllabus to follow, did not stop to consider whether she might have a point. Week 5. The lesson on manual override of planetary survival protocols. Gorvik explained that in the event of technological failure on a Class 4 planet, the recommended approach was to locate the nearest Union beacon and activate the distress signal. Standard procedure. Tested. Approved by 17 committees over the course of 60 years. Petra raised her hand. "What if there is no beacon? There is always a beacon within standard range. What if the beacon is damaged? The probability of total beacon failure is 0.003%. What if a bear sat on it?" The classroom went very quiet. Even the environmental hum seemed to hold its breath. Gorvik looked at her. She looked back at him with an expression of absolute genuine inquiry. "Bears," Gorvik said slowly, "do not have the body mass to destroy a Union emergency beacon through simple contact. Terran bears have been recorded at over 800 kilograms. The beacon housing is reinforced to withstand pressures exceeding 3,000 kilopascals." Petra appeared to do a brief mental calculation. "Okay," she said. "A bear probably could not destroy it. But what if the bear sat on it, and then did not move, and the signal was blocked by 360 kilograms of bear that was also angry because it was cold?" Varantos made a sound that in Falori loosely translated to "I would like to be excused from this conversation." Gorvik took a breath. He had been a professor for 37 years. He had patience. He had discipline. He was a professional. "Miss Wynne," he said, with the gentle firmness of a being who had explained things to very confused students for a very long time, "I appreciate your creativity, but we must stay within the parameters of the official curriculum. The beacon scenario does not account for large fauna interference because, statistically, it is not a meaningful variable." "I just think," Petra said, "that maybe the people who wrote the curriculum have never been to a place where the variables are angry and weigh 800 kilograms. There was a silence. Gorvik moved on. But here is where the story shifts. Here is where what had been a slow, mild, almost charming classroom disagreement began sliding toward something that Gorvik would spend the rest of his career using as a cautionary tale at faculty orientation events. Week 6. The lesson that would later be described in the official incident report as the precipitating event. The topic was reflex response and physical conditioning across species. It was a chapter Gorvik had always found satisfying to teach because it was full of elegant data. He could show, clearly and with evidence, how different evolutionary pressures produce different physiological responses, how a Filori student could process incoming information across 6 sensory streams simultaneously, how a Dorothy student carried ancestral chemical memory that allowed near-instant threat identification by scent alone, and how humans, while impressive for a Tier 3 Deathworld species, were ultimately a mid-range example, capable, certainly, survivors, undeniably, but nothing that the galaxy needed to reconsider its frameworks over. He pulled up the reflex response data. He explained the standard scale. He pointed to where humans fell on it. Petra raised her hand. "That data is 40 years old," she said. Gorvik looked at his datapad. He looked back at her. "The core physiology of humans has not changed in 40 years, Miss Wynne. The data collection method has, though. Those numbers were taken from sedentary human subjects in controlled laboratory conditions. The update from 12 years ago using active populations from high-stress environments put the response times considerably lower." Gorvik blinked. He had not read the update from 12 years ago. In 37 years of teaching this curriculum, no one had ever asked him to. "Where did you encounter this information?" he asked, because he was curious and also because he wanted to know if she was making it up. "My mother is a wilderness emergency responder," Petra said. "She was in a study. I read the paper." There was a pause. "Could you provide the citation after class?" "Sure," Petra said. She provided it. Gorvik read it that evening. It was, to his deeply inconvenient surprise, completely accurate. The update existed. The numbers were different. Meaningfully, documentably different. He sat with this information for a long time. He was a scientist. He respected data. He knew that the responsible thing to do was acknowledge the correction, update his teaching materials and move forward. He did not do this. He had 37 years of teaching this curriculum. He had a lecture plan for the following week. He had 17 other students who had not once, in 5 weeks, caused him to question a single slide, and he was, if he was being perfectly honest with himself, a little bit annoyed. Not at Petra, exactly, more at the general situation of being 64 years old and being corrected by a 19-year-old from a planet where the bears sat on emergency beacons. Week 7. The lesson on pain tolerance and physical stress response. This was where things went wrong. Gorvik was explaining that the primary function of pain response was to create behavior modification. Pain tells an organism to stop doing the thing that is causing damage. It is across most species reliable, consistent. The body sends a signal, the mind receives it, the action ceases. He was explaining this when he noticed that Petra was not looking at him. She was looking at her notes from 2 weeks ago. The data, the reflex study. He could see the printed paper on her desk, folded neatly but clearly present. He had not updated his lecture. He had not acknowledged the correction. He had simply continued as though the conversation had not happened. Petra was not making a scene about this. She was not saying anything. She was simply sitting there, looking at a piece of paper that proved him factually wrong, saying nothing, which was somehow more pointed than saying anything. Gorvik was explaining pain tolerance variances across species. He said, in the course of this explanation, that humans had a relatively standard pain response for Tier 3 species, and that their notable characteristic was not tolerance, so much as a well-documented tendency toward adrenaline-mediated suppression under acute stress. Petra looked up from her paper. "That's not quite right either," she said quietly. And Gorvik, who had been a professor for 37 years and was having a deeply irritating semester and who had, crucially, read the warning in the diplomatic guide and still managed to forget it in the moment, made the worst decision of his professional life. He walked to her desk. He reached out. He tapped the back of her hand with 2 fingers. The universal Vossian gesture for pay attention to the lesson, not your distractions. It was not a hard tap. It was the kind of thing he had done with inattentive students hundreds of times. A light correction, a physical punctuation mark, a reminder. He would later describe the next 3 seconds as the most educational experience of my entire career. Petra did not flinch. She did not gasp. She did not look startled or upset or any of the things that 19 years of teaching had conditioned him to expect. What she did was look up at him, slowly, with an expression that was entirely calm, and entirely certain, and somehow older than her face had any right to be. And then the classroom went very, very still. Nobody moved. Not Veritas. who had turned a shade of blue so deep it was practically violet, which in Filori culture meant something that did not have a clean translation but roughly approximated, "I am witnessing an event I will describe to my grandchildren." Not Brana Chi, who had gone so pale gold she was practically glowing. Not the 12 other students seated across the room, each one suddenly very interested in becoming as physically small as possible without technically leaving their seats. The only sound in Classroom 7 was the soft, consistent hum of the environmental controls, which had no idea what was happening, and were maintaining a pleasant 72 degrees with the cheerful indifference of a machine that had never made a catastrophic error in its life. Gorvik's 2 fingers were still hovering in the air, approximately 4 centimeters above where Petra's hand had been a moment ago, because Petra had moved her hand, not fast, not dramatically, just quietly and completely out of the way you move something you do not want damaged before something heavy falls on it. She was looking at him. He was looking at her. The silence lasted exactly 4 seconds. He counted them later, in the incident report, because it felt important to be precise about the duration of one's own worst decision. "Professor Spellin," Petra said, and her voice was so calm it made the calmness feel like a separate entity in the room, an additional presence, a third party to the conversation. "Did you just tap my hand?" Gorvik opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. It was a standard redirection gesture, used commonly in Vossian educational contexts to encourage student focus. Petra nodded slowly. The way you nod when someone has just told you something you already knew, something you had already processed, something you had filed away in the part of your brain labeled "things I am going to address in a moment." "I see," she said, and then she stood up. Now, Gorvik was not a small being. He was 192 centimeters tall by Vossian standard measure, with the dense, deliberate frame of a species that had evolved on a planet with 1.5 times Earth's gravity. He had 3 joints in each arm, excellent torque distribution, and bones that a Terran orthopedist would have found frankly insulting in their structural efficiency. Petra Wynn was 168 centimeters tall and weighed by his student intake records approximately 61 kilograms. He did not feel concerned when she stood up. He felt something more like the academic version of awkward, the sensation of realizing you have done something socially unwise, but not yet understanding the full dimensions of how unwise. "I want to be clear," Petra said, standing there in her second row seat with her hands at her sides and her voice at a perfectly reasonable volume, "that I am not angry. I want you to know that specifically because I think sometimes people confuse what I am about to say with anger, and it is not anger, it is a correction," Gorvik said. "Miss Wynn, I apologize if the gesture was culturally inappropriate. I simply meant to indicate that your attention should be directed to the lesson material rather than outside documents." "I understand what you meant," Petra said, "and I want to explain something to you about where I come from, because I think it is relevant to this class and to this moment." She reached into her bag calmly without breaking eye contact, and pulled out a datapad. She placed it on the desk. "I grew up on a continent where, from approximately age 5, children are taught to register physical contact from an unknown direction as a potential threat, not because the culture is violent, but because the environment requires it. You learn it the way you learn to check your boots for spiders before you put them on. You learn it because once you do not, and something happens, you understand that the lesson is permanent." Varen Toss had stopped breathing. Gorvik could see his chest had ceased its standard oscillation pattern. In Filori biology, this happened when the brain received a threat signal and started directing all resources toward processing it. "I am telling you this," Petra continued, "because in approximately 6 seconds I am going to demonstrate the pain response data that you declined to update your curriculum with, and I would like you to have context before that happens." Gorvik said. "Miss Wynn, that is not necessary." "Professor Spellin," Petra said, and for the first time she smiled, and it was a very specific kind of smile, warm and completely genuine, and also absolutely final. "I have been sitting in your classroom for 7 weeks. I have corrected 4 factual errors in your curriculum. I have provided citations. I have been patient. And then you tapped my hand to tell me to stop paying attention to data that proves you wrong." A pause. "So yes," she said, "this is a little bit necessary." What happened next took 3 seconds. Gorvik would later describe it to his colleague Professor Duna Ferris in the kind of precise, slightly shell-shocked detail that people use when they are trying to make sure the memory stays accurate, because they suspect no one will believe them otherwise. Petra moved to his right side, not aggressively, not rushing, just stepping into position with the economy of motion that he had seen in exactly one other being in his life. A retired Union military coordinator named Sovereign Helt, who had spent 20 years in field operations and moved through any space the way water moves through a gap, finding the exact right angle without appearing to look for it. She took his right arm at the wrist and just above the elbow. Her grip was not painful. That was the first thing he registered, and it startled him, because he had expected pain and the absence of it somehow made everything more unsettling. the way silence in the middle of a storm is more alarming than the noise. Then she applied pressure. Not a lot of pressure. A controlled, specific angled force that traveled up his forearm, found the primary load-bearing joint of his species' middle arm connection, and informed it politely but with complete authority that it was going to rotate approximately 15 degrees further than it typically did, or face consequences. Gorvik made a sound. It was not a dignified sound. He had made more dignified sounds stubbing his third toe on a doorframe at 3 in the morning, but it was involuntary, and it was loud, and it caused Brana Chi to flare every secondary color receptor she possessed simultaneously, which looked extraordinary. Petra released him. Immediately. Completely. The grip was there, and then it was simply not there, and Gorvik was standing in the front of classroom 7 cradling his right arm against his chest, staring at a 61-kilogram 19-year-old from a planet where the bears were tier 3, and clearly everything else had been dramatically underassessed. His arm was not broken. This was important. She had not broken it. She had taken it to the exact point where breakage was the next step, held it there for 1 full second so that he could understand what that point felt like, and then let go. The difference between what had just happened and an actual fracture was a decision she had made. Deliberately, in the middle of applying the technique, she had chosen where to stop. This was, Gorvik would later explain to the medical officer who examined him, significantly more frightening than if she had simply broken it. That, Petra said, and she sounded entirely conversational. The way you sound when you have just demonstrated something in a lab setting and are now moving to the explanation portion is an adapted joint manipulation from a wilderness emergency restraint protocol. It is used in situations where a large, potentially dangerous animal or person needs to be redirected without being harmed. The grip exerts force along the natural weak axis of most mammalian shoulder joints. It works on bears. She picked up her datapad. It also works on Vossian joint structures, because your secondary arm connector operates on a similar biomechanical principle, which is in the paper I cited 3 weeks ago. The one in the updated dataset. The one with the corrected reflex and pain response numbers. The classroom was so quiet that Gorvik could hear his own heartbeat, which was going considerably faster than regulation. Petra sat back down. She smoothed the paper on her desk, the one with the reflex study data, and picked up her pen. "I would like to return to the lesson now," she said, "if that is all right." It was at this point that Gorvik realized something fundamental had shifted in his understanding of the universe. Not dramatically, not with music playing in the background and a light shining down from above. More like the feeling of opening a door that you thought led to a closet and discovering it led to an entirely different wing of the building that you had no idea existed. He sat down. Not in his usual spot at the front, in the position of authority and instruction. He sat in the nearest available chair, which happened to be the one directly across from Petra's desk, because his legs had made a unilateral decision about the situation, and he had simply followed their advice. "Miss Wynne," he said, and his voice was impressively steady, he thought, given the circumstances. "The data in your cited study. Walk me through it." Petra blinked, just once. A small recalibration. "Now?" she asked. "Yes," Gorvik said. "Now, please." And so Petra Wynne, while 15 students watched in various states of biological alarm, and the environmental controls maintained their cheerful 72 degrees, walked her professor through 12 years of updated human physiological data that his curriculum had not accounted for. She was good at explaining it. Clear. Patient. Which by this point did not surprise him at all. She drew comparisons to things she knew he understood from his own coursework, made connections between the human data and the Filori and Dorothi data already in the curriculum, and at one point stopped to answer a question from Varen Toss, who had apparently forgotten to be afraid of her somewhere between the arm demonstration and the point where she started cross-referencing biomechanical stress studies across 4 species. When she finished, there was a silence, a different kind of silence from the one before. Less loaded, more thoughtful. Gorvik looked at the datapad in his hands where he had been taking notes which he had not done in a classroom since his own student years and said, "Why did you not push harder on this from the beginning?" Petra considered the question seriously. "Because you were not wrong about everything. Most of the curriculum is accurate, and I did not come here to be the person who walks into someone else's classroom and tells them their whole career is incorrect." That seemed unnecessarily rude, but it was acceptable, Gorvik said slowly, to demonstrate a joint restraint technique on my arm in front of the entire class. Petra looked at him with those calm, soil-brown eyes. "That was a direct response to a direct physical action, Professor. The curriculum thing was just a disagreement. Those are not the same category." Gorvik thought about this for a long time. "No," he said finally. "I suppose they are not." The formal incident report filed with the Academy's administration that afternoon was a remarkable document. It had been written by Gorvik himself, which meant it was precise, thorough, and conspicuously honest in the places where honesty was deeply uncomfortable. He noted that he had initiated physical contact without consent. He noted that the student's response had been controlled, targeted, and immediately ceased upon establishing the intended point. He noted that no injury had occurred. He noted that he had been in violation of the union's own guidelines on interspecies physical contact in academic settings, which he had known about and had failed to apply because decades of teaching a single-species classroom had made him complacent. He also included, as an attachment, a formal request to the curriculum committee to review the outdated physiological data in chapters 4 through 9 of the xenobiology program, with specific citations provided by a first-year student who had apparently known about the problem for 3 weeks and had been waiting patiently for him to notice it himself. The administration called him in 2 days later. The dean, a Falori named Sovek Anar, who had been running the academy for 22 years and had therefore seen most of the things that could happen in an educational institution, read through the report in full while Gorvik sat across the desk and tried to look appropriately reflective. Sovek set down the report. "She did not break your arm," he said. "No, she took it to the point where she could have broken it and then chose not to." "Yes. And this distinction," Sovek said, "was meaningful to you." Gorvik thought about the 1 full second in which the decision had been made. The controlled release, the immediate return to composure, the way she had sat back down and picked up her pen. "It was the most meaningful distinction I have experienced in 37 years of teaching." "Yes." Sovek looked at the ceiling for a moment. Then he looked back at the report. "The curriculum update request has already gone to committee. 3 of the 5 members have reviewed the cited data and confirmed the discrepancy." Gorvik nodded. "The student," Sovek said. "Petra Wynn. Her academic record, exceptional," Gorvik said. "Her written assessments are among the strongest I have received from a first-year student. Her observational analysis is, in several areas, more sophisticated than students 3 years ahead of her." Sovek nodded, reading something on his own datapad. "She applied to the xenobiology program specifically because she wants to work in interspecies field medics, environments where union personnel operate on or near Deathworld adjacent ecosystems. That is consistent with her academic focus," Gorvik said. She noted in her application, Sovek continued reading, that she felt the current curriculum had significant gaps in its treatment of Deathworld origin species and their physiological characteristics. She said, and I am reading her exact words here, that she believed the gaps existed because most of the people writing the curriculum had never been somewhere where the variables were, in her phrasing, angry and heavy. Gorvik was quiet for a moment. "That is a direct quote," he said. "She used those exact words to me in week 5. She also used them in her application essay," Sovek said, "written 8 months before she arrived at this academy." Gorvik sat with this. 8 months before she had walked into his classroom. 8 months before the bear conversation, and the beacon conversation, and the reflex data conversation. She had already identified the problem. She had come here knowing what she was walking into, knowing that the curriculum was behind, knowing that the people teaching it had never been to a place where the winter hit -40 and something with 800 kilograms of mass made autonomous decisions about where to sit. She had come anyway. She had sat in the second row. She had taken notes. She had been patient. And when he had finally and inexcusably put his hand on her desk and told her to stop pointing at the truth, she had shown him, precisely and without malice, exactly what the outdated curriculum had missed. "What are you recommending?" Gorvik asked. "She receives a formal acknowledgement of her academic contribution to curriculum review," Sovek said. "Standard procedure when a student identifies a documented error in program materials." He set the datapad down. "You receive a formal note in your file regarding the contact incident which you are already aware of, and which you will be required to complete a refresher module on interspecies conduct guidelines." "That is entirely appropriate," Gorvik said. "It is," Sovek agreed. "And Gorvik," he paused. "The fact that you wrote this report the way you did, including all of it, the parts that were professionally uncomfortable." Gorvik waited. "That," Sovek said, "is also why you have taught here for 37 years. Gorvik walked back to his office. He sat down. He opened the curriculum files for chapters 4 through 9 of his xenobiology program, the ones he had been teaching in their current form since the early part of his career, the ones that a 19-year-old with calm eyes and a paper from her mother's study had quietly, persistently, correctly identified as wrong. He began revising them. It took him 4 evenings. He sent each revised chapter to Petra Wynn for review, with a brief note explaining what he had changed and why, and asking if she had further corrections. This was strictly speaking not standard academic procedure. He did it anyway. Her responses were careful, specific. She caught 2 additional errors he had missed. She was polite about both of them. On the last evening, after he sent the final chapter and received her final note, He sat in his office and thought about the diplomatic guide his colleague had given him at the beginning of the semester. The one with the single red highlighted sentence about not making physical contact with humans. He had read it. He had nodded. He had assumed it was an exaggeration. The thing about assumptions, he thought, was that they were most dangerous not when you were ignorant, but when you had just enough knowledge to feel confident, and not quite enough to know what you were missing. He had been a professor for 37 years. He had survived a semester with a Veldori student. He had guided beings whose perception of reality was structured in ways he could barely conceptualize, and he had needed a 61-kilogram human from a continent with -40 winters to take his arm and show him exactly where he had stopped learning. The curriculum update was formally approved 6 weeks later. In the acknowledgments section of the revised Chapter 4, under Student Contributions to Accuracy Review, there was a name, Petra Wynn. First year, Earth. At the bottom of her copy she had written in pen the way she wrote everything, in her clear and completely specific handwriting, a small note to herself. It said, "Sometimes the lesson teaches the teacher. Just make sure they remember it." She underlined it once, neatly, and moved on to the next chapter.
Would you have been as patient as Petra? Let me know. Will you like and subscribe if you enjoyed
God brought you
it,
here for
and
a
I will
reason.
see
If you
in
believe in the
next
power
one.
of the human spirit, hit subscribe. Join the golden age. See you among the stars. Witness this. This is why God gave humans such an unbreakable will. No force in the galaxy can hold us back.